I'd like first of all to mention that I have now published my second book in the They Got Away with Murder series. It's in the same format as the first one. It's the second eight stories in the series. This was the first 8. Here's the second, revised suitably as I saw fit, and updating my thoughts and so forth, and correcting some obvious errors. They always occur, and I'm sure there'll be errors still. You'll see that I've put it in, although it's exactly the same design, I decided it needed distinguishing. So rather than put it in my ubiquitous blue, I decided to do it in grey. And for the rest of the series, I will alter the colour of the volume in some tasteful way, I hope. But I reached the conclusion that my books were becoming a bit overwhelmed by the blue. So anyway, that's the change I decided upon. It's got photographs in it, and also my drawings, if I can find one. Oh, there we go. There we are. There's the drawings in the George Harry Stores case. So anyway, that's done. I noticed actually, last night I spent some time going through the reviews for my books on Amazon, and I was absolutely delighted by the quantity and quality of them. So thank you for all those who bought the book and troubled to make suitable comments on them. Thank you. In the early hours of the 31st of May 1810, the valet to the Duke of Cumberland, Joseph Sellis, was found murdered in his bed in St. James's Palace. I think it was a murder. I don't think there's ever been questioned, really, that it could have been anything other than a murder. The only question is, who did it? It's a curious case, fascinating case for me, because I used to regularly visit St. James's Palace when Charles, who is now the King of England, was the Prince of Wales. I used to visit him many years ago now, perhaps 20, 25 years ago, and was a regular visitor there. But I had no idea about the crime then. And I've been trying, while I've been researching this case, I've been trying to locate myself in the palace to find out exactly where the crime took place, and I can't do it. My memory fails me. It's very plush, very palatial, but I've no idea where it actually occurred in relation to where I was. I'd like to have had a feel for it in that way. The question is, who killed Joseph Sellis? Was it really His Royal Highness the Duke of Cumberland, the 5th son of King George III and future King of Hanover himself? You decide. May the 30th, 1810, had been a busy evening for Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, the youngest son of King George III. He had dined at Greenwich and then attended a concert at the Opera House in aid of the Royal Society of Musicians. It was past midnight when he arrived back at his apartments at St. James's Palace, and by his own account went directly to bed. One of his 3 valets, Cornelius Neal, slept in an adjoining room to that of the Duke, and although it was customary for only one valet to sleep in the Duke's apartment at any one time, there was, on the evening in question, another valet situated along the hall, Joseph Sellis. At about 2:45 a.m., the Duke was awoken by a hissing sound, and was struck on the head 4 times by an assailant who was, he said, wielding a sabre. He put up his hands to protect himself from the blows which continued to rain upon him. In spite of his injuries, he leapt from bed and ran from his room, his would-be assassin having given the Duke a further wound to his leg. The Duke called out to his valet, who slept in the adjoining room, "Neil, Neil, I am murdered!" His valet, Cornelius Neil, who appears not to have heard the commotion, promptly appeared at the Duke's chamber door, and saw his master in distress and with blood on his face. He took up a poker, and the Duke told him his assailant was still within his chamber, upon which Neil called for assistance. The household was quickly in a state of alarm. A porter, Benjamin Smith, came to assist, and the valet's wife, Mrs. Neil, appeared on the scene. The Duke gave orders that the palace be secured and no one be permitted to leave. He then spoke to Mrs. Neil regarding the other valet in the royal apartments, Joseph Sellis. "Where is Sellis? Call him at once." Mrs. Neil, along with some other servants, went to Sellis's room along the corridor and knocked on the door, calling out that the Duke had been murdered. Receiving no reply, they decided he must be in his family quarters elsewhere in St. James's Palace, and went off to find him. Mrs. Sellis assured them that her husband was sleeping in the royal apartments that night, and so they returned there. Sellis's room had 2 doors to it, one from the corridor, which they had already tried, and another leading from the ballroom, which they had not, and so they went round to this door. As they reached it, they heard a strange gurgling sound within. A sergeant from the Coldstream Guards entered the unlocked room and discovered Sellis lying straight and flat on his back on the bed, his head propped up against the headboard. His throat had been slashed so deeply it had almost severed his head. Both his arms lay neatly by his sides, and a cut-throat razor lay on the floor 2 feet from the bed. He was dressed in his trousers, shirt, waistcoat and stockings, and his jacket lay nearby, folded over the back of a chair. A basin of bloody water was on a washstand in the room. His pocket watch was seen to be hanging above him, apparently fully wound. Meanwhile, the Duke of Cumberland, who was now lying on the bed in his room, feeling faint through loss of blood, was attended by his doctor, Sir Everard Hume. He was treated for his wounds and had them bandaged. Fortunately, none were thought to be life-threatening. Later that day, having given a statement to the coroner, Samuel Thomas Adams, about the matter, the Duke was removed to Carlton House to recover. This account is essentially that given by the Duke of Cumberland of the circumstances of the attack on him in the early hours of the 31st of May, 1810. He said he had heard a hissing sound, which he thought might be a bat attacking him. His valet, Cornelius Neil, told of his being awakened by the Duke's calling him, and encountering the Duke at the door of his chamber, who had informed him that the would-be assassins were still within. Neil had stood on the bloodied cutlass, which lay on the floor at the door, and his footsteps were traceable along the corridor as a result. He also said that he had looked in one of the closets near to the Duke's room, and discovered 2 bolster cushions there, which adorned the Duke's bed during the daytime, a lantern, a bottle of water, a scabbard for the cutlass, and a pair of black leather slippers, in each of which was marked the name Sellis. It was clear to both the Duke and Cornelius Neil that the dead valet, Joseph Sellis, had attempted to murder the Duke, and having failed, had returned to his own room and killed himself. The dead valet, Joseph Sellis, was an interesting man. He was born in Piedmont, Sardinia, around 1775. His family and background are obscure, but he appears to have had a good education, being literate, and speaking French, then the official language of Piedmont, Sardinia, and very good English. In 1791 he was licensed as a wig-maker in Marseille, and that same year travelled to Paris. Possibly his plans were interrupted by the French Revolutionary Wars and the turmoil of 1792. In any case, he made his way to Britain, and in March 1793 was employed by a wealthy businessman, MP and radical Jacobin John Barker Church, as his valet. They travelled to New York, where some valuables went missing from the house there, and Mr. Church accused Sellis of the theft, as a result of which he was dismissed from the post. After this, he was said to have travelled to Philadelphia, and then returned to England, where he was, in spite of the accusations made against him, employed by Lord Mount Edgecombe, and in 1796, or possibly 1798, he was taken on as a valet to King George IV.'s brother, the Duke of Cumberland, at St. James's Palace. It was an astonishing progression to obtain such a position of trust in the royal household within so short a time of his arrival in Britain. He quickly became a favourite of the Duke, and in 1798 he married Mary Ann Mayland at St. George's, Hanover Square. They lived with the Duke in St. James's Palace and had 5 children, the youngest of whom was named Ernest Augustus, after the Duke himself. Of all the wayward sons of George III, none was regarded with such disdain as the Duke of Cumberland. He was born Ernest Augustus in London in 1771, the 5th son of George III of the United Kingdom and Hanover in Germany. Prince Ernest was educated for the most part in Hanover and undertook military training there, being commissioned as a captain in the cavalry. While serving with Hanoverian forces during the French Revolutionary Wars of 1793, he was badly injured and lost the sight of his left eye. The prince was given the formal title of the Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale in 1799, and decided to take up his position in the House of Lords. His political views were, without exception, extreme, and he enjoyed a terrible reputation, both politically and personally. He was the subject of many rumours, undoubtedly involved in sexual misdemeanours, and was also believed to be the father of his sister Princess Sophie's illegitimate child, a boy who was raised by the king's equerry, who was an elderly man called Thomas Garth. The coroner, Samuel Adams, took depositions from the Duke and Cornelius Neil, the valet, and this resulted in his forming a definite and firm view of what had occurred. An inquest was conducted on the 1st of June, at which Coroner Samuel Adams opened with a statement that a violent attack had been made upon the Duke of Cumberland, and that there was very little doubt but that it was done by the deceased, Sellis. Witnesses gave accounts of the events of the evening and other circumstances relating to the deceased man, Joseph Sellis. The Duke's account of the evening was given by written statement only. He did not appear in person because he was convalescing at Carlton House. The servants, guards, porters, and residents at St. James's Palace, and the doctors, gave their accounts, which more or less corroborated the events as previously outlined. Cornelius Neil, the valet, and first to attend the Duke on the night of the attack, said that Sellis had taken an intense dislike to himself in recent years, and he found him to be a morose and malevolent man who would not be contradicted by another. Mrs. Anne Neil, his wife, confirmed her husband's opinion of Sellis, stating him to be obstinate and quarrelsome. The dead man's widow, Mary Ann Sellis, did not agree. She said her husband was calm, a caring husband and father to her and to his children. He never drank or gambled, owed no money to anyone, and was in possession of no bad habits or vices. He had been suffering with a cold in recent weeks, but was substantially recovered, and had been in excellent spirits the day directly preceding his death. They had gone to the market, and afterwards walked in St. James's Park with the children, and he had indicated to her that he would be sleeping that evening in the royal apartments. Her husband, she said, had no animosity towards the Duke, and the family had been indebted to His Royal Highness for the consideration he had shown them, acting as godfather to their youngest children, and giving them presents. She did, however, state that her husband had disliked Neil, and had, 2 years earlier, spoken of leaving the Duke's employment on this account. She said she had exhorted him to remain, saying they had a good situation and excellent quarters at St. James's Palace, and for these and other advantages he should make no further trouble over the matter. After this he had not spoken of it again to her. A servant called Sarah Varley said she had, some months previously, found a poker concealed under Cornelius Neal's bed while she was making it, and she and another servant said that a double-barreled pistol had been found in a bag in Neal's possession in his room adjacent to the Duke's, and when challenged on this, Neal had said he kept it as protection against Sellis. Being deeply unhappy with the presence of a gun in the house, they had told Neal if he did not remove it, they would inform the Duke of their find. After this, the gun had, it seems, been removed. Sarah Varley was also willing to swear there had been no slippers, lantern, nor sword in the closet when she deposited the 2 bolsters in there on the evening of the 30th of May. 3 servants who had formerly known Sellis many years earlier in New York were found, and they spoke of the theft in New York at Mr. Church's house, for which Sellis had been blamed and was subsequently dismissed. They said he was an intemperate man who had been known to say, "Damn the king and all the royal family," and "Damn the Almighty," and they had the impression he had a strong antipathy towards Britain. They were very much surprised to hear he had found employment in the royal household. A man called Antonio Panzera, valet to the Duke of Sussex, said he had walked with Sellis on the 22nd of May in Windsor Park, and the latter had told him of his grievances against Neal, and also that the Duke used him ill and spoke sharply to him. Nevertheless, he said he regarded Sellis as being a mild man, of few words. Other witnesses from the palace said Sellis was a pleasant and unruffled man, not given to violence or strong sentiments. 2 letters which gave an insight into the character of Sellis were submitted to the inquest. Both were written by Sellis, apparently in his own handwriting. The first, dated the 9th of July, 1809, was addressed to Captain Benjamin C. Stevenson, a senior household courtier. Sir, I am extremely anxious to know His Royal Highness's decision concerning the evidence produced before you against Mr. Neal, and I beg you, sir, to have the goodness to relieve me of this most disagreeable suspense. If I may, sir, judging from appearance, either His Royal Highness has not been acquainted with what has been proved, or His Royal Highness has entirely forgiven him. Should the former be the case, sir, I hope you will have the goodness to acquaint His Royal Highness to the full extent of the roguery of this man. Had this business been in a court of law, the man would have been transported for at least 7 years. And what I am about to communicate to you now is, I believe, transportation for life. I have been told that Mr. Neal cheats His Royal Highness in everything he buys. I have already ascertained this to be the fact. On the toothpicks he gains by charging 1 shilling and 6pence for that for which he only pays 1 shilling, and on the soap he charges 2 shillings for that for which he only pays 18 pence. It will be found that the dishonesty of this man has no bounds. You must, sir, be satisfied that this man is as great a villain as ever existed. The other letter, addressed directly to the Duke himself, complained about his discomfort in travelling in the Duke's carriage on the outside. Both letters appeared to be copies of letters he had sent, and they were discovered in Sellis's room by the coroner, Samuel Adams. Adams also found a pair of shoes at the foot of Sellis's bed. There was no key in the unlocked door next to the head of Sellis's bed, but he subsequently found the key to this door in the room. He also found in Sellis's pocket a key which unlocked the green baize door in the gallery or corridor. At the end of these proceedings, the jury gave their verdict of felo de se, or suicide, against Joseph Sellis. There was no doubt on the part of the jury, the coroner, or the newspapers that Sellis was an ungrateful servant who had attacked his master with intent to murder him, and having failed in this, took his own life when tracked to his room. This account and verdict was issued to the press, All newspapers carried a more or less uniform version of it, upon which they embroidered their own opinion. It was an easy sell. One newspaper opinion of the 7th of June, 1810, was typical. "The degree of revenge to which an Italian may be driven is proverbial," it proclaimed. And the Morning Post went further still. "Of all European countries, we confess our dislike of the Italians is the most keen. We did not want this most glaring and abominable instance of the foul association of so many detestable vices to confirm and justify our aversion to that race of men." The Morning Star was plainly not fond of Italians. However, an equally outraged, but more circumspect, Cheltenham Chronicle confessed to a certain mystification concerning the matter of motive. "No sufficient motive is made out," it considered, "even for an Italian mind. No important or recent dissatisfaction is stated, and still less is any cause of jealousy made out, the only one that might be supposed adequate to so desperate a retaliation." And herein, laid out in the mildest form, by a publication which had no radical or anti-monarchical sympathies, is stated the widespread dissatisfaction with the version of events given by those authorities who were, in one degree or another, affiliated to the royal households or bound to them by the force of tradition. It is important to have this statement from a sober authority, because writers on the subject since, historians and others, have sought to attribute the dissent which arose from the official narrative as being chiefly due to radicals who were intent on spreading rumours of a malicious nature due to the unpopularity of the Duke of Cumberland. But this is wrong. The concerns of the public were real. If the radical press sought to take advantage of them, it was not because they were invention, but because they were present amongst all classes and persuasions in society. There was, to put it simply, a belief that the Duke of Cumberland was responsible for his valet's death, either by murdering him or by having his valet Cornelius Neil do so. It was further suggested that the reasons for doing this were that Sellis had discovered Neil and the Duke engaging in what was described as an abominable act, and Sellis had been killed to ensure his silence. This belief enjoyed wide currency at the time. Rumours concerning the Duke's homosexuality were commonplace, to his attending male brothels, or molly houses, as they were termed. But it did not originate with his enemies, as some historians have claimed. Cornelia Knight, for instance, lady companion to Queen Charlotte, wrote in her diary that Sellis was left-handed, and the blow that had killed him was delivered from left to right, in other words, by a right-handed person. This does not appear in the official account, but she seems to have believed it to be the case. She was also suspicious that Neil had been dismissed from his post so soon after the attack, but was awarded a pension by the Duke. She clearly implies by this, but does not state it explicitly in her diary, that Sellis had discovered something had occurred and was killed for this reason. Cornelia Knight, it should be said, was a blue-stocking, an intellectual, a writer, a multilingual translator of poetry, and an artist-illustrator held in considerable regard. She was not a radical, an agitator, or anti-monarchist. She was simply recording privately what she had heard at court. Others at court are known to have held the same view, as we shall see. The rumours had such presence and momentum. In 1813, a journalist published the rumour and received 15 months' imprisonment for the offence. All of this added to the deep unpopularity of the Duke of Cumberland, and the royal family were deeply embarrassed by it. He spent a great deal of time abroad. The accusation was suppressed, but it remained an open secret. But it couldn't be proved. It was merely a suspicion. Then, in 1832, 22 years after the events at St. James's Palace, a book was published called The Secret History of the Court of England from George III to George IV. It was ostensibly written by Lady Anne Hamilton, a courtier and political writer. She subsequently denied she had written it, but it seems likely she was, at the very least, its source. Its description of the events and political intrigues of the previous 70 years from the accession of King George III is of considerable importance. Although by no means accurate in its details, the depth of knowledge and insight into the relations within government and between the characters at the heart of government and court leave no doubt its author was extraordinarily well informed and well connected. On its publication, the book caused a sensation. The most shocking part of it was the account concerning the death of Joseph Sellis in the palace on the 31st of May, 1810. It claimed that the Duke of Cumberland had been caught by Sellis engaging in an abominable act with Neil, and that he was killed by the Duke to silence him. In effect, it stated only what had long been a matter of public rumour, but it had a powerful effect of presenting this in an authoritative fashion and placing it on the public record. It made 6 arguments in support of this claim. First, it argued it was highly unusual that the Duke's regimental sword was in his bedroom on the night of the attack. Second, the Duke's wounds were superficial and examined by his doctor in the absence of any other person. The implication here was that the Duke's wounds were self-inflicted to shore up his story that he had been attacked. Third, the situation of Sellis, laid on his back on the bed, hands by his sides and head against the headboard, was inconsistent with the claim that he had committed suicide. Fourth, the attendant, the principal witness, a man named Dew, had given a quite different version of events of the night in question, and as a result had not been called to give evidence. Fifth, the Duke's injuries, although claimed to be severe, were actually minor, and this was apparent by the fact that at Carlton House, where he was recuperating, he had been seen out on daily walks. Sixth, a first jury refused to give a verdict, but a second gave one readily, which was compliant with the official narrative of events. The account went further, stating that had the Duke of Cumberland been a poor man, rather than the son of a king, he would have been hanged on the evidence, circumstantial though it was. Such accusations could not be ignored. The Duke was openly accused of murder and of an abominable act with his valet, also a capital offence at that time. A libel writ was issued in the High Court. It was a perfunctory rather than a thorough affair, largely because the publisher, Josiah Phillips, fled to France, and the alleged author, Lady Hamilton, did likewise. Neither could therefore be questioned on any aspect of this. Various statements were furnished to refute the libel. Dr. Everard Hume submitted a written statement concerning the Duke's injuries and their severity. He also indicated that the Duke had been hors de combat for over 2 months. A statement from the valet, Cornelius Neil, was obtained, which simply denied the accusation that he had engaged in an act with the Duke. It was claimed that the mysterious man named Dew, if required, would swear he had not given an alternative version of events to anyone. The original coroner, Samuel Thomas Adams, attested that the jury had been properly constituted and the investigation was thorough and proper. Only the Duke himself gave evidence in person. His version of events differed substantially from that he had given 22 years earlier, although perhaps the passage of time might account for this. Dr. Hume's statement was demonstrably incorrect in its claim that the Duke had been confined to the house until August, as he had been seen out in mid-June, according to the newspapers. The man, Dew, curiously, was never required to submit a deposition even, and no one, including the Duke, was subject to cross-examination. There was, in the absence of a challenge to these rebuttals, little doubt as to the outcome. The Duke had proved his libel. The book was heavily suppressed in Britain, but published in the US. It did little to quell public suspicions, though, simply prevented the claims from being published. The following year, in 1833, the Duke's butler committed suicide, apparently because he regarded the Duke as being a tyrant. The verdict here was suicide too. In this case it probably was, but the death of Sellis cast a long shadow. There are many problems with the official narrative of the events at St. James's Palace on the 31st of May, 1810. To begin with, why did Sellis apparently conceal himself in the closet near to the Duke's chamber for at least 3 hours, awaiting his moment? He possessed the keys by which he could gain entry to it without this necessity, and the closet conferred no special advantage on him. It required him to bypass Neil's room, incurring further unnecessary risks. Why did he leave behind his slippers in the closet, helpfully bearing his name inside them? Had he been intending to return for them after killing the Duke? He knew full well he would incur the additional and quite unnecessary risk of having to bypass Neil's room again. If Sellis did conceal himself in the closet, then it would have involved 4 trips through the Duke's room, and close by Neil's room too. The first trip to conceal himself in the closet, the second to attack the Duke, the third to recover his slippers, and the fourth to return to his own room. And there was no need for such additional risks. Sellis had a key to the Duke's bedroom. He needed only enter at his own leisure at any point, attack the Duke, and then return to his own quarters. And why had he taken the sword belonging to his master as his weapon of choice, and taken it and the scabbard into the closet with him? Its presence in the Duke's room, as the libel pointed out, was inexplicable. It should have been removed when the Duke's regimental uniform had been taken 3 days earlier. How did Sellis think he might subsequently escape from St. James's Palace after the murder, if this was his intention? There were guards to keep the occupants of the palace secure, but they would also inhibit a murderer's escape. It has been suggested that he intended that his nemesis Neil should take the blame for the murder, but if so, his deciding upon spending the night in the royal apartment himself, against usual practice, was a rather incriminating matter for him. He was, effectively, the one person out of place that night. Suspicions would inevitably turn on him. He was an intelligent man. He must have known this. He must have known, too, that he would be covered in blood because of the means by which he sought to prosecute the murder. He would at once incriminate himself in the crime. But the most serious objection to his having attacked the Duke with the sabre, one which overrides all others, was the fact that it had been sharpened to a razor's edge in preparation for a military inspection 3 days earlier. It was some 17 inches in length, its blade curved and 3 inches wide, but had a lethal point to enable it to be used as a stabbing device too. And yet, standing over a sleeping man in a dim-lit room, and striking 4 times at the head of the recumbent figure of the Duke, with all the advantages this conferred on him, he could only inflict relatively minor wounds on the Duke. A child could have done better. One suggestion was made that the sharper a sword, the quicker it would blunt. That may be true, but blunting itself on a man's skull would surely have the effect of causing fatal injuries to him. The Duke's cuts mended in a matter of 2 weeks, and we know that on the 14th of June, just 2 weeks after sustaining his injuries, in spite of what his doctor told the 1833 libel trial, the Duke was walking in Carlton House grounds. This was reported in the newspapers in mid-June 1810. It has been argued that Sellis struck the Duke with the flat of the sabre and therefore seriously lessened the impact of the blows. But this won't do either. It would hardly require any degree of competence with the sabre to comprehend that it is effective in purpose only when used as an edged weapon, or as a stabbing one. Apparently this was beyond Sellis. He struck a number of other blows against the Duke, who rose from the bed to escape. He seized the blade, which cut his finger seriously, he said. He suffered a wound to his leg from it too, before escaping from the room. The question then, as now, is, how is it possible that of all these blows, and with the advantage of the weapon, Sellis was incapable of delivering a single strike capable of seriously injuring the Duke? Sellis abandoned the sabre, dropped it at the door and fled, we are led to believe, the Duke closing the door upon him and calling Neil. In one version of events, the Duke claimed to have seen the intruder exiting the other door of his bedroom and making off in the direction of Sellis's room. Now in this he appears to be creating a leading narrative, because the door through which the intruder exited was the only one available to him. It certainly indicated no intended destination. The Duke appears to trip himself up here, too. In 1833 he claimed to have saved himself only by succeeding in closing the door on his assailant, who pursued him to the door and dropped his sword there. This is quite incompatible with the Duke's earlier claim that he had seen the assailant exiting the room in the direction of Sellis's room. It is also inconsistent with what Neil reported of the matter. He said the Duke had informed him his assailant was still in the room. This leads us to the other great mystery of the public account. If Sellis did attack the Duke and then commit suicide, then how is it that incapable of delivering a telling blow with a sabre, which is made for the purpose of causing injury or death, he was able to almost sever his own head with a simple cutthroat razor? Furthermore, it was suggested that he had at first attempted to cut his throat through a padded cravat, and having failed, removed it and struck again at his bare throat. This is absurd. Why would he try to frustrate his own intention in this way by cutting through his padded cravat? And is it possible that he could exert the force to inflict such a terrible wound, to do that which he had been incapable of doing to someone else with a sharpened cavalry sabre, though he attempted it 4 times at least? It is not. The razor was found on the floor 2 feet away, no great distance, but his arms were laid straight by his sides, according to those who discovered the body. The attitude of the body and the man's arms are not consistent with those of a man having just succeeded, by a terrific exertion of willpower, to almost behead himself. His body was flat upon its back on the bed, his head propped against the headboard too. That does not seem to be a helpful position in which to cut one's own throat. His chin must have rested on his chest. The famed anatomist Joseph Carpio, who conducted a ground-breaking rhinoplasty operation to reconstruct a soldier's nose and is regarded as being the father of modern cosmetic surgery, viewed the body of Sellis and told his students that he had a number of wounds to the rear of his neck, as well as at least 2 to his throat. Sellis, he observed, had not one but several wounds on the back of the head. If Sellis had meant his own decollation, he must have begun behind his neck, but labour as he might, it would only hack and hew his flesh, for no physical strength would be sufficient to terminate the existence of an individual by beheading himself. He regarded it as absurd that Sellis could have committed suicide. Again, Carpio was not some vicious radical, nor a political opponent of the Duke, but a revered medical man of the highest international renown. The blood in the washstand was thought to be where Sellis had cleaned himself, having attacked the Duke, but this would obviously serve anyone else just as well, so there is no favour given either way. The attack and the circumstances attending it are not satisfactorily or convincingly dealt with by the inquest. If it is accepted that it is impossible that Sellis committed suicide, then there are only 3 remaining possibilities. First, that Cornelius Neil attacked the Duke and then killed Sellis to lay the blame on him, because he was, as Sellis had claimed, the greatest rogue that ever lived. But Neil was in the ascendant. Sellis was the aggrieved party, and he had clearly failed in his attempts to have his rival removed. It hardly served Neil to remove his benefactor, the Duke, who tolerated his petty pilfering, nor could Neil have physically attacked the Duke and made his way round to his room via the other door to the Duke's room, and the yellow room, and the ballroom, and into the gallery. There does not seem to be a practical way of doing so, given the room layout. The Duke would inevitably encounter Neil coming from the gallery, rather than from his room. Second, that the Duke killed Sellis for some unknown reason, and then inflicted the wounds upon himself to cover his crime. Third, that the Duke conspired with Neil in some manner in the murder of Sellis. In summary, only the Duke, or the Duke and Neil together, can have killed Sellis. No other explanation is practical to my mind. So what did happen on the night of the 30th of May, 1810, at St. James's Palace? There are a number of statements that can be made concerning this which suggest what occurred. First, it is as near to a certainty that we are likely to get that Joseph Sellis did not commit suicide. This is shown not only by the fact that to almost behead oneself with a cutthroat razor is practically impossible, and that even if this was possible, the position in which the body was found, flat on its back, arms by its side, head up against the headboard, and a razor discarded to one side on the floor, contradict this. That an initial attempt had been made to cut through the cravat Sellis was wearing before removing it and making a fresh attempt is absurd, and that Sellis had apparently locked his door from the gallery from the inside, but failed to lock the rear door from the ballroom, even though the key to this was available, is incredible. The failure to lock the rear door, when he could have done so, makes a nonsense of his having locked the first door. His intention to exclude others from his room was thus foiled by his failing to lock the second door. Second, the razor was not the weapon used to kill Sellis. The wound was described as being 6 inches wide across the throat, severing all major arteries, windpipe, etc., to a significant depth. Hume told the court it was a heavy wound. All the indications are that this wound was surely made by a sword, wielded by a third hand. The razor was a feint laid by his side to supply an impression that he had cut his own throat. The several wounds Sellis had received to the rear of his neck, according to Carpue, support the notion that it could not have been made by Sellis. In fact, it suggests that a struggle took place, that he sustained injuries in that struggle, and the throat being cut was the coup de grace which ended his life, after he had already been subdued. Further, the sedentary and flat position on the bed, the head awkward upon the headboard, suggest that Sellis had been placed there. If this is correct, then the only other place he could have been killed was in the Duke's bedroom, because it was the only other place where blood was discovered in a substantial quantity. Third, the attack on the Duke was, according to the evidence he and others gave, impossible. Both he and Neil claimed the sword was used in the attack on the Duke, but this is quite impossible. 4 blows to the Duke's head, delivered by a sharpened sword, would, under almost any conceivable circumstances, even if delivered by a weak person, have hacked the Duke's head from his body. The injuries to the Duke's head were not consistent with their being caused by the sword. They were caused by some other object or implement, quite possibly the poker. This was known to have been present. Fourth, it defies common sense that Neil, who claimed to be sleeping next door to the Duke, a room which was separated by a single wood-panelled partition only, did not wake to the commotion or struggle, but had to be called by the Duke after his escape from the room. We are told the sword was ragged and blunt from its business. Considerable violence had been done. There was damage to the door and to the bed, yet Neil heard nothing. Fifth, although it is possible that Sellis might have concealed himself in the closet, It seems probable that he would not have done so, and if he was the assailant intending to murder the Duke, then he would have no need to. There can be little doubt that the Duke of Cumberland killed Joseph Sellis as a result of a row that evening, which became physical between the two men, and the Duke's injuries, which do not appear to bear any similarities with those inflicted by a sword, were either caused by an assault by Sellis or self-inflicted, as the libel of 1832 had claimed. One thing must be said. Neil and the Duke must both have known what had occurred that night, due to the proximity of both during and after the attack. It is certainly possible, even probable, that all three men were present during the altercation, or part of it, and that Sellis was overpowered during a struggle, and was then returned to his room, where he was murdered. It is highly unlikely that the Duke could have struggled with Sellis without its rousing Neil from the adjacent room, which was separated from the Duke's by a thin partition. It is also highly improbable that Neil could have murdered Sellis, attacking the Duke as a blind, to establish Sellis as an assailant, suicide. There are too many objections to this, too many risks for such a convoluted scenario to play out. And if the Duke's version of the attack is true, then it is quite impossible that Cornelius Neil could have emerged from his room when the Duke called him. He would have emerged from the gallery, and it would have been immediately apparent that he had come from elsewhere. For these reasons it is highly probable that the Duke of Cumberland murdered Joseph Sellis, and that Cornelius Neil assisted in this in some manner. But what was the cause of the altercation which led to a struggle and to Sellis's death? There are two possibilities. The first relates to the letter found at Sellis's bedside, a copy of a letter previously sent, which showed, along with witness accounts, that there had been a grievance against Neil for at least 2 years. Sellis's row with Neil, his antipathy towards the man, which must surely have been reciprocated by Neil himself, was Sellis's obsession. It was excessive. The greatest rogue who ever lived, he calls him, because he has charged 1 shilling and 6pence for that which has only cost him a shilling. It is absurd, and it is clear that the courtier, Stevenson, thought it a minor matter, which was best overlooked. He must have brought it to the Duke's attention. He was bound to do so, but the Duke was hardly interested in this. But to Sellis it was an affront. He was stubborn. Those who knew him said so. He took the fleecing of the Duke in the matter of a few pence personally. It became a focus of his resentment against Neil. He clearly pursued the matter of his investigations into Neil's fiddling the Duke over 50 toothpicks with great persistence. It was his nature. He would not be contradicted, they said. He was quite determined to assert his right in this matter, to have it acknowledged and accepted by all that Neil deserved transportation not only for 7 years, but for life, for his fiddling of toothpicks. It is, of course, absurd, but Sellis could not see it. He put it down in his own handwriting, in letters to senior courtiers like Benjamin Stevenson and Major Thornton. It must have mystified them, almost like a child insisting their mother take action against a sibling for some childish offence. But Sellis was blind to the absurdity of it. Neil was the greatest rogue who ever lived, a man it was impossible for a decent person to be in company with, he said. What rows occurred between Sellis and Neil as a result of Sellis's actions, his letters, his accusations, and what other matters arose between them, what threats Sellis may have made to his adversary, are beyond us. But it is a fact that Neil had taken to sleeping with a poker concealed in his bed, that when a double-barreled pistol was found in a small bag near his bed, he admitted to a servant that it was kept out of his fear of Sellis. All of this came to a head on the evening of the 30th of May, 1810. Sellis had arrived at a decision. He was going to take the matter up directly with the Duke, demand that he take action against the worst rogue who ever lived. He may have already indicated to the Duke that he wished to discuss something with him. Later, the Duke would wave him away brusquely. He had no desire at all to discuss the matter of Neil, but Sellis took this literally. He was a man who would do so. He would regard it as an appointment, however vague it may have been. Later was that evening. He was not hiding in the closet with a lantern and the sword for 3 hours that evening. Why would he? He had every means of entering the Duke's bedroom using his keys. Lurking in a closet near to Neil's and the Duke's rooms incurred many risks of discovery, and there were no advantages to it. He was dressed and awaiting the Duke's return that night. He would be well aware of the Duke's itinerary and of his return. He went to the Duke's room to speak to him about the matter of Neil. The Duke had no interest in either discussing the matter with his servant nor of the matter of Neil. The Duke was a bad-tempered man. He was mean, nasty, dismissive, and he could be violent. His brother, the Duke of Clarence, said, "If you have a tender spot on your foot, he likes to tread on it." Sellis had the persistence of a crank. Servants testified that he would talk back to the Duke. The two quarrelled, and it came to blows, because Sellis had nurtured this hatred of Neil for at least 2 years. He would not be turned away, and the Duke was not going to be told what to do by his querulous Italian valet. If war is diplomacy by another means, then fighting is the natural consequence of a disagreement between men which has run its course. In this case, it had done so. Sellis attacked the Duke with some implement available to him, perhaps the poker, striking him on the head several times, and Neil, hearing the altercation, quickly intervened. The sword became involved. The blows to the rear of Sellis's head were natural where 2 men were involved in attacking him. He was overcome, but not before he had done some damage to the Duke and to the room. And he was killed by means of the sword, either in the Duke's apartment or in his own, having been carried there by the 2 men. He was laid out on his bed, rather too neatly and improbably, because in such a situation people do not have time or the presence of mind to consider everything. The razor was left beside Sellis's bed to suggest suicide, and to remove any question that he was killed with the Duke's sword. They washed up in the basin, which was found to be filled with bloody water. They locked the door from the inside, but they needed to get out of the room also, and the key was not in the rear door, so it could not be locked. Sellis knew where the key was. It was discovered in his closet, according to the coroner Adams. It was a weakness to leave the door unlocked, because Sellis would surely have locked it if his intention was to keep people out of his room. But the Duke and Neil had no choice. The key was not available to them. They then returned to the Duke's room. Here they, or possibly Neil on the Duke's instructions, arranged the scene, placing Sellis's slippers in the closet and the scabbard in there too, to imply that Sellis had concealed himself there to attack the Duke, to remove any suggestion that Sellis had been killed by the Duke's sword, which would leave the Duke with difficult questions to answer. Why was the sword in the Duke's room? It may have been Neil who had kept it close by, as he had the poker and double-barreled pistol previously. He feared Sellis. Now the alarm was raised. The Duke made the specific point of directing the servants and guards to Sellis's room. "Where is Sellis? Fetch Sellis!" Thus the circuit of the narrative was closed. It is my belief that this is probably what occurred, or something like it. But there is a second theory, which has perhaps an equal claim, or almost an equal claim, to being the true explanation of the matter. This is that Sellis may indeed, as was widely believed, have caught the Duke and Cornelius Neil in a compromising situation, and have concealed himself in the closet for this purpose. This theory has the advantage of explaining why he would be hiding in a closet near to both the Duke's and Neil's room, which in the former theory must be denied. Thus, as a result of intentionally surprising them, Sellis was murdered. The Cheltenham Chronicle had, after all, expressed its mystification at the apparent lack of motive, even for an Italian, and gave its view that such a crime could only be motivated by the extreme emotion of jealousy. If this view is correct, then Sellis's hiding place was apt. He was metaphorically and literally in the closet. There is no way of knowing which of these occurred. We don't have all the evidence. There are omissions. There are contradictions which were never, at the time, resolved. All things considered, it seems likely to me that the former account, that of a row between the Duke and Sellis over Cornelius Neil's pilfering of toothpicks, absurd as it may seem, was the cause of a struggle which had a fatal outcome. But the latter explanation, of a homosexual triste, a triangle even, in which jealousy was the driving motive, seems to have been favoured by gossiping courtiers, the radical press, and even the public. The rumours and sly references to them dogged the Duke of Cumberland in the years following 1810. He attended the hanging of two homosexuals in 1811, following the Vere Street scandal, perhaps to quell such stories about his own sexual proclivities, and in 1814 he married Princess Frederica Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was herself suspected of killing her husband the previous year. He was by this time 42, and his marriage was probably, in part, to further quash the rumours. In any case, there were an abundance of other reasons for the public to dislike the Duke. He became Grand Master of the Orange Lodges of Irish Protestants, was an extreme anti-Catholic, extreme in all his views. He did his best, and successfully, to frustrate Catholic emancipation. He had a son called George in 1819. He continued to be a bull in a china shop, a thorn in the crown, and spent an increasing amount of time in Germany, to everyone's satisfaction. In 1837, his niece, Queen Victoria, ascended the throne of the United Kingdom. A woman was not able to ascend the throne of Hanover, and so Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, became the King of Hanover. For the first time since 1714, Britain and Hanover were divided. Ernest Augustus got on poorly with Victoria, but he reigned in Hanover until his death in 1851, at the age of 80.